The fire was snapping in the hearth, throwing warm orange light across the Persian rug my late husband Arthur and I had bought in Istanbul 30 years ago. Outside, a soft December snow began to lace the windows. It was the picture of peace. My stepson Garrett sat on the ottoman, leaning forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A detail I noted, but didn't yet question. He handed me a large, flat box wrapped in silver paper. "This is from the heart, Margaret," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. I remember the weight of the box. It was too light for a sweater, too rigid for a scarf. I pulled the ribbon slowly, the sound of the paper tearing like a long, slow sigh. Under the lid, there was no tissue paper, no scent of lavender or pine. Just a stack of white bond paper stapled at the corner, with a blue notary seal gleaming like a bruise against the white. Resting on top was a black felt-tip pen, its cap already removed, waiting. Garrett didn't wait for me to read it. He leaned in, his hand hovering near my wrist. "It's just a formality, Margaret. Dad would have wanted this handled." I looked at the bold header, Revocable Living Trust Amendment. Then I looked at the signature line where my name was expected to go. My pulse didn't quicken. Instead, a familiar chill settled in my spine. The kind I used to feel in an interrogation room when a suspect finally started to spin their web. I could smell the sharp pine needles and bourbon on Garrett's breath. He thought he was being clever, using the sentiment of Arthur's first Christmas gone to catch me at my weakest. He expected the usual tears, or perhaps a confused signature born of grief-induced exhaustion. He didn't realize I was looking at the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he wouldn't meet my gaze for more than a second. He had made a fatal error in judgment. 31 years reading liars. He'd chosen the wrong morning. Before we continue, I must clarify that I have changed the names and specific details of this account to protect the privacy of those involved. This is my truth, told from the perspective of a woman who spent 3 decades watching how quickly a person's face can change when they think they are about to get what they want. I spent my career as a senior fraud investigator, and I've always found human nature to be the most unpredictable variable in any equation. That is the only reason I'm sharing this today. I've heard from so many others like me, and it would mean a great deal if you would leave a comment letting me know which city or country you are watching from. It helps me understand how far these stories truly reach. Now let's go back to that morning by the fire, because Garrett was still waiting for me to speak. I am Margaret, 67 years old, and for 31 of those years I worked for the federal government. I thoroughly investigated complex financial crimes. I followed the money through shell companies, hidden offshore accounts, and carefully falsified ledgers. You learn quite a lot about a person by looking at exactly what they try to hide. My husband, Roy, never hid a thing. Roy was 71 when a sudden cardiac event took him from me. Just 14 months before that Christmas morning with Garrett. Roy was a quiet, self-made man who had built a modestly successful regional construction business from nothing. He believed in tangible things, brick, mortar, and always paying cash. By the very time we married, he actually owned our home outright. It was a modest, single-story ranch sitting on a quiet cul-de-sac, but it was ours, and it was completely free of debt. It was the physical embodiment of the life we built together. Deliberately simple, deeply safe. Our marriage was genuinely happy because we clearly understood the value of quiet moments. Every Christmas Eve, without any grand ceremony, Roy would reach down into a worn cardboard box and pull out a small, hand-carved oak ornament. He made it himself during our very first Christmas together. It was shaped like a little house, rough around the edges, with our initials scratched into the flat wooden base. He would find a sturdy branch near the top of the pine and set it there gently. That small piece of wood meant more to me than any jewelry he could have purchased. It was a quiet promise, made and kept year after year. Roy had 1 son from his first marriage. Garrett was 42 and worked in commercial real estate. When Roy and I first married, Garrett was in his 20s and desperately trying to prove himself. He was unfailingly polite, and occasionally he even managed a forced sort of warmth. I never pretended to love him like a son. That would have felt entirely false to both of us. But I respected the effort he made for his father's sake, and I always assumed that respect was mutual. I watched him navigate his career, quietly noticing the way he charmed clients and closed big deals. He was sharp, ambitious, and deeply focused on optics. I recognized the type. I had interviewed hundreds of men just like him. Still, he was Roy's boy, and I welcomed him into our home for Sunday dinners and holidays, without any reservation. When Roy passed, the silence in the house was deafening, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Garrett stepped in to help with the immediate arrangements. He handled the caterer for the reception. He ordered the floral sprays. At the time, I honestly thought it was an act of grace, a son honoring his father. I was too wrapped in my own fog to see the appraisal in his eyes as he walked through the halls, looking at the crown molding and the hardwood floors. I thought we were two people mourning the same good man. I thought the lingering looks he gave my paperwork were born of genuine concern. Grief changes people. I knew that. What I underestimated was how much planning some people do before the grieving even starts. Over the 10 months following the funeral, Garrett's visits steadily increased in frequency. Yet, the nature of those visits fundamentally shifted. He wasn't bringing comfort. He was taking inventory. He would sit at the kitchen island, nursing a lukewarm black coffee, while his calculating eyes slowly catalogued the value of the room. Then came the questions. They never arrived together. They were carefully spaced out, dropped casually into conversations weeks apart, always perfectly framed as a devoted son's gentle concern. Had I given any thought to downsizing? It was an awful lot of house for one person to maintain, after all. Had Roy ever discussed moving the property into a family trust before he passed? It could save so much trouble later. Had I taken the time to have the deed reviewed recently by a professional? Just to ensure everything was properly recorded. He delivered each question with a practiced, sympathetic tilt of his head. I did not react with immediate alarm. I simply noted the inquiries, filing them away exactly the way I was trained to log glaring discrepancies in a corporate ledger. With complete, unwavering, clinical attention. The definitive turning point arrived on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a single dish, when I heard Garrett's voice drifting from the backyard patio. His tone was entirely different out there, clipped, impatient, transactional. I paused, keeping my silhouette safely hidden behind the curtains. "She won't be a problem," Garrett said to whoever was on the other end of the line. "She doesn't really understand how any of this works." I did not walk outside. I did not demand to know who he was speaking to or what he truly meant. I simply turned, quietly slid the window shut, poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and sat down at the dining table with my thoughts. My hands were perfectly steady. A second crack appeared a few weeks later when Garrett's wife, Dina, began accompanying him on his Sunday visits. Dina was a woman whose smile seemed permanently affixed to her face, regardless of the situation. She began steering our conversations toward assisted living facilities. She kept her tone light, breezy, and relentlessly helpful. She would casually mention a beautiful community her friend's mother had just moved into, emphasizing the gourmet meals and the lack of yard work. "It is just something to look into, Margaret," Dina would often say, softly patting my hand with perfectly manicured fingers. "Just in case. We only want what is absolute best for you." I smiled back at her, thanking her for her immense thoughtfulness. Behind my polite smile, the entire picture was finally coming into sharp, undeniable focus. I had personally seen this exact pattern play out in hundreds of financial exploitation cases throughout my 31 years at the federal agency. I knew exactly what I was looking at. It was the soft campaign, the long approach. They were preparing the ground. The soft campaign quietly stretched into late November. Following yet another tense Sunday dinner, Garrett departed in a sudden rush, leaving his heavy wool jacket draped casually over the back of a dining chair. The following morning, my cell phone rang. It was Garrett. He asked me if I had found his phone charger and begged me to check the pockets of his coat. I agreed, setting the receiver down. I walked slowly to the dining room and slid my right hand deep into the exterior pockets. Nothing. I reached into the interior breast pocket. My fingers brushed against thick, stiffly folded paper. No phone charger. I withdrew the paper. Instead of dry cleaning receipts, I found a legally drafted document. I slowly unfolded it under the harsh light of the dining room chandelier. It was a quitclaim deed for the house. The very house Roy and I had built our life in. The house we had completely paid off. Right there on the grantor line, my full legal name was neatly typed in bold ink, ready to permanently sign away my complete legal interest in the property. Tucked beneath the deed was a separate, smaller folded page. It bore the name, official stamp, and direct contact information of a notary public. A quick, discreet professional inquiry later that very afternoon would confirm exactly what I instantly suspected. This specific notary had a long-standing, highly lucrative professional relationship with Garrett's commercial real estate firm. They had the paperwork perfectly staged. My breathing remained entirely steady. I did not panic. I simply retrieved my personal smartphone and took perfectly clear, high-quality photographs of both pages. I ensured the natural lighting was sharp, capturing every single typed letter and every official seal. Then, I meticulously folded the pages along their original creases, slipped them securely back into the dark interior pocket of his wool jacket, and hung the coat neatly by the front door. I did not call Garrett back immediately. I let the heavy silence stretch. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the solid oak table, the very table where Roy and I had eaten countless quiet breakfasts. I let the precise, ugly shape of what Garrett was attempting settle deep into my bones. Throughout my decades investigating complex financial crimes, I had seen quitclaim deeds weaponized exactly like this countless times. It is one of the oldest, most insidious instruments of elder financial exploitation in existence. An adult child isolates an aging parent, feigns concern, and slips a prepared deed into a stack of routine paperwork. Garrett truly believed I was merely a lonely widow, softened by profound grief and easily manipulated by his charm. He thought his polished shoes and practiced smiles entirely masked his blatant thievery. He fundamentally misunderstood exactly who was sitting alone in his father's house. He had foolishly mistaken my quiet mourning for cognitive decline. He'd made a document. I'd spent my career making cases. We were not playing the same game. I did not return Garrett's call that day, nor did I call him the next. Instead, I picked up the telephone and made two very specific calls. The first was to my personal attorney, a brilliant woman named Patricia, whom I have trusted for over 20 years. The second was to an old partner of mine, someone still actively working complex financial crimes at the federal level. Patricia reviewed the photographs I sent her. Her voice was grave as she confirmed exactly what I already knew. If my signature landed on that typed line, the results would be legally devastating. I would effectively deed away my rightful survivor's interest in the home I had lived in for 16 years. I would be left completely unprotected and entirely at Garrett's mercy, living as a mere guest in my own sanctuary. My old partner gave me the exact same advice we used to drill into junior investigators working high-stakes cases. Establish the strict documentation protocol immediately. Record dates, preserve exact quotes, and ensure all physical evidence is carefully time-stamped and securely stored in multiple locations. I went out and purchased a simple black and white composition notebook. I placed it quietly in the kitchen desk drawer right beside the worn dictionary where Roy used to keep his daily crosswords. I sat down and began to log everything. I documented every single unannounced visit, every loaded question about my cognitive health, every subtle, smiling suggestion from Dina about the absolute luxury of assisted living facilities. I felt the anger, of course. A deep, cold, righteous fury radiating from the center of my chest, settling like a heavy stone in my throat. But I did not perform it. Outward anger is a massive liability when you are trying to trap a thief. I was simply doing what I had always done throughout my entire professional life. I was quietly building a clean, completely irrefutable record of fact. On the third day, the kitchen telephone rang loudly again, breaking the absolute silence. I looked down at the bright caller identification flashing Garrett's name. I cleared my throat, placed my hands flat on the cool oak table to ensure they were perfectly steady, and finally answered the incoming call. My voice was warm, completely open, and deeply apologetic for missing him earlier in the busy week. Of course, I'll keep an eye out for the phone charger, sweetheart. The 3 weeks that followed required every ounce of discipline I had cultivated across 31 years of federal service. I became someone else entirely. I became the confused, overwhelmed widow Garrett desperately needed me to be. I called Garrett 2 days after our brief phone conversation about the missing charger. I let my voice waver slightly, injecting a carefully measured note of helpless uncertainty. I told him I had been thinking about that deed thing he mentioned months ago. I asked if he could please explain it to me again. Slowly this time, because I found legal documents so terribly confusing since Roy passed. I could practically hear his pulse quicken through the receiver. He came over that Saturday afternoon, armed with a leather portfolio and his most patient, condescending smile. He sat beside me on the living room sofa and spoke slowly, using small words, explaining how a quitclaim deed would simply transfer my interest in the property into a family trust. For my protection, of course. For simplicity. I nodded along, widening my eyes at appropriate moments, asking him to repeat certain phrases. I watched him relax incrementally with every naive question I posed. Dana arrived the following weekend with glossy brochures for 3 different estate planning attorneys. She spread them across the kitchen table and talked at me for 40 uninterrupted minutes about the importance of getting my affairs properly organized. I let her talk. I nodded. I occasionally interrupted with questions that sounded utterly innocent, but were specifically designed to draw out more detailed admissions. So this would mean Garrett would handle all the big decisions for me? And the house would technically belong to the trust, not to me directly? That does sound so much simpler, Dana. Roy always handled these things. She answered every question with enthusiastic confidence, completely unaware she was building my case with every single word. After each visit, I retreated to the kitchen drawer and retrieved my composition notebook. I recorded every conversation as close to verbatim as my trained memory allowed. Dates, times, exact quotes. I noted their facial expressions, their tones, and the specific moments when their masks slipped slightly. The key moment arrived in the 2nd week of December. I manufactured it carefully. Garrett stopped by unannounced to drop off a poinsettia plant. I invited him inside for coffee. As we stood in the kitchen, I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my neighbor Harold had offered to look over any paperwork I might need help understanding. Harold was a retired attorney, I explained. Very kind. Very thorough. I paused, letting the silence stretch. But I told him I probably wouldn't need it, I continued, stirring my coffee slowly, because Garrett handles everything now. I watched his expression transform. The brief flicker of alarm smoothed into something warmer, more confident. He reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. That's exactly right, Margaret. I've got you covered. His timeline accelerated immediately. 1 week before Christmas, he called to ask if he could bring a little paperwork to the holiday gathering. Just signatures, nothing major. A simple step toward getting my estate properly organized. His voice was bright and eager. I agreed with audible relief, thanking him for being so thoughtful during such a difficult year. Running a performance against a family member is not easier because the relationship is closer. It is significantly harder. Every instinct screams at you to confront, to accuse, to demand an explanation for the betrayal unfolding before your eyes. But the discipline remains exactly the same as it was in every interrogation room I ever sat in. You stay in character. You protect the case. You do not let what you feel change what you do. 2 days before Christmas Eve, I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink when I heard Garrett's voice drifting through the cracked window. He was standing on the back patio, phone pressed to his ear, speaking to Dana. "It's basically done," he said. "She's ready to sign. She doesn't suspect a thing." I dried my hands slowly on the dishcloth. I walked to the kitchen drawer, retrieved my notebook, and recorded the phrase in careful handwriting. I dated the entry. Then I closed the notebook, placed it back in its hiding spot, and began preparing for Christmas. Christmas morning arrived, wrapped in silence and falling snow. I woke early, dressed carefully, and placed a single phone call to confirm that everyone was in position. The hand-carved oak ornament hung on its branch near the top of the tree, catching the soft morning light. Roy's quiet promise still kept. Garrett and Dana arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. He carried a silver-wrapped box under his arm, the same box I had already seen in my mind 100 times. Dana followed behind him, her smile fixed firmly in place, a bottle of champagne clutched against her coat. They stomped snow from their boots and entered my home with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. We exchanged small pleasantries. I offered coffee. Garrett declined, eager to move things along. He guided me toward the dining room table and placed the silver box directly in front of me. His eyes were bright with anticipation. "Open it, Margaret. This one's special." I pulled the ribbon slowly. I lifted the lid. My fingers found the document inside, the notarized seal gleaming under the chandelier. I let my hand drift to my heart. I looked up at Garrett with an expression of overwhelming gratitude. "Garrett, this is so thoughtful. You've thought of everything." I picked up the black felt-tip pen he had placed beside the box. I held it for a long moment, watching his shoulders relax. Then I set it back down on the table. "I mentioned to my neighbor Harold that I had some paperwork coming," I said gently. "He said he was happy to stop by this morning if I wanted a second set of eyes. I hope that's okay. I just always feel better when I understand things fully." Garrett's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, that's perfectly fine." A knock sounded at the front door. I rose slowly and crossed the living room. I opened the door to Harold, who stepped inside with a quiet nod. Behind him stood Patricia, dressed in a charcoal wool coat, carrying a slim leather briefcase. I introduced her warmly. "This is my friend Patricia. She used to do estate law. I asked her to join us." Garrett's expression began to shift. The color drained slowly from his face as Patricia approached the table and extended her hand toward the document. He did not move to stop her. She picked up the pages and read them in complete silence for 30 seconds. Then she looked directly at Garrett. "This is a quitclaim deed," Patricia said evenly. "If signed, it would strip Margaret of all survivors' interest in this property. Do you have a licensed real estate attorney present, Garrett? Because I have some questions about this notarization." Garrett opened his mouth. No sound emerged. I reached into the sideboard drawer and withdrew my composition notebook. I placed it on the table beside the silver wrapping paper. I did not raise my voice. I opened to the first dated entry and began walking through the log. The September phone call overheard in the backyard. Dina's repeated conversations about assisted living facilities. The draft document discovered in the jacket pocket. The accelerated timeline after I mentioned Harold's offer to review paperwork. Dina started to speak, her voice rising defensively. I looked at her and held her gaze until she fell silent. I gave you every chance to stop. The room went completely still. Garrett stared at the composition notebook, his eyes moving across the dated entries, the direct quotes, the careful documentation of every conversation he thought had gone unwitnessed. I watched him begin to understand the scope of what had been built against him. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Patricia filed a formal complaint regarding the notarization the very next morning. The notary's established professional relationship with Garrett's firm constituted a glaring conflict of interest, placing the document's preparation in immediate, serious legal jeopardy. Meanwhile, my old partner made a quiet, informal inquiry through his professional channels. He did not initiate an official federal investigation, but his questions were sharp enough to prompt Garrett's commercial real estate firm to conduct a rigorous internal review of his recent transactions. That review yielded exactly what my experience told me it would. 2 other clients, both elderly and recently widowed, subsequently came forward with similar stories of aggressive pressure regarding property transfers. Garrett did not go to prison. The deed was never signed, and the scheme was interrupted before it could fully execute. However, the state regulatory board placed his real estate license under an indefinite supervision requirement pending a comprehensive review. In our tightly knit regional market, a supervision mandate is a death knell. His professional reputation evaporated overnight. Dana filed for a legal separation precisely 6 weeks after Christmas. I felt no triumph when I heard the news, nor did I feel any particular sorrow. It was simply the inevitable collapse of an arrangement that had been built on convenience and the expectation of unearned wealth. Once the prospect of easy money disappeared, the marriage followed suit. The final contact came 3 months later. The telephone rang on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I answered to hear Garrett's voice. He sounded tired, but beneath the exhaustion, I immediately recognized the practiced cadence of an emotional appeal. He invoked his father almost immediately. He told me that Roy would never have wanted this kind of public embarrassment. He admitted to making some careless mistakes, framing them as well-intentioned errors made under the heavy stress of grief. Then his tone shifted to accusation. He told me I was destroying the only family I had left. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the entire call without interrupting him once. I let the silence stretch after he finally stopped speaking. Roy would have wanted me safe in my home, I said quietly. You tried to take it. I didn't destroy the family, Garrett. You just finally let me see it clearly. I placed the receiver back down firmly on its cradle. The click of the plastic was sharp, hollow, and beautifully definitive. I did not bother to block his personal number, nor did I change my deadbolt locks. The locks were already entirely secure, and I knew with absolute certainty that he would never ever call my number again. The ugly matter was simply closed. I walked over to the sink, washed my coffee cup, and watched the soft spring rain wash against the glass. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a heavy, suffocating silence. It was just peace. The case was fully resolved. The historical record was absolutely clean, and my own home was securely, permanently mine. The following Christmas, I decorated the house alone. That sentence would have sounded unbearable to me once. Instead, it felt honest, quiet, earned. I carried the storage boxes in from the hall closet one at a time and set them on the living room rug. The lights were the same white lights Roy always preferred. The glass angels were still wrapped in old newspaper. And at the bottom of the last box, tucked into yellowing tissue, was the small, hand-carved oak ornament. He made our first Christmas together. The little house, our initials scratched into the base. For several minutes, I simply held it in my palm. The wood was smoother now from the years of handling, the corners softened by time. Every Christmas before that one, Roy had placed it on the tree without comment, as though love did not need an announcement to be real. That year, for the first time, I reached up and placed it there myself. Near the top, on a sturdy branch. My throat tightened, and then, just as quietly, it eased. I found that I could do it. That surprised me more than I expected. The house felt different by then, not larger, not emptier. Stronger, perhaps. Less like an object people could circle on paper, and more like what it had always truly been. A place I had chosen, lived in, protected, and defended. There is something clarifying about nearly losing what you assumed was secure. When I took this house for granted, it was home. After I defended it, it became mine in a deeper way. Not because of a deed, because of what it cost me to keep it honest. Not everything stayed broken. Roy's sister called me in early autumn, awkward at first, then tearful. Garrett had been quietly cooling people toward me during those months after Roy died, suggesting I was overwhelmed, forgetful, not quite myself. Some believed him because grief makes uncertainty easy to plant. but truth has a way of outlasting performance. By Thanksgiving, Roy's sister and 2 of his grandchildren from an earlier branch of the family came to stay with me. They stayed 2 nights. We ate too much pie, argued gently over card games, and let the old stories come back into the room where they belonged. It was not a miracle. It was better than that. It was repair. And if you are listening to me now with that particular heaviness in your chest, then you may already know this kind of betrayal does not always arrive wearing a criminal's face. Sometimes it arrives with groceries, sometimes with concern, sometimes with a smile and a pen already uncapped. It happens in 1,000 variations, and too many decent older people are taught to doubt themselves before they doubt the person pressing them. So let me say this plainly. The people who call you confused are usually the ones hoping you won't notice what they're doing. Grief is not the same thing as weakness. But some people cannot tell the difference, and that is their fatal mistake. I did not win because I was clever. I won because I was patient, and I kept my records. That is the part I want most to leave with you. You do not have to shout to protect yourself. You do not have to explain your instincts to people who benefit from your silence. Write things down. Save the papers. Date the conversations. Tell one trustworthy professional the truth before the pressure campaign teaches you to minimize it. Composure is not surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. If something like this has happened to you, or is happening even now in some quieter form, I hope you will share your story in the comments. I read more of them than you might think, and I know other people here do too. If this story reached you, please like and subscribe so it can reach someone else who needs it while there is still time. That evening, after the lights were on and the room had gone still, I stood in front of Roy's little oak house hanging near the top of the tree and whispered, "I'm home, Roy."